We founded an Obsidian wine company in 2002, and we'll tell you just a little bit about our background before we jump into oak. Behind me is a huge oak tree, if not actually at the vineyard, but that oak tree is perhaps the largest live oak in North America. It sits at the very bottom of Obsidian Ridge. And you can see my son on one side and Alex Bellows, our winemaker's son, on the other. They're about 5'9". That is an enormous oak tree. It's been around for probably 700 or 800 years. It's an incredible specimen. We do not use it for our barrels, and we won't plan on using it for our barrels, but it's an incredible example of nature. I guess my brother and my story started with our father. Our father escaped Hungary in 1956. He ran from the basically communist regime that was in charge at that time, and he settled along with my mother in California and became interested in the wine industry in the late 60s and early 70s. He planted Poseidon Vineyard in the far reaches of Carneros in 1972. And, you know, he was just trying to put food on the table. He met the Pepe brothers of Robert Pepe Winery. If you know that winery, it is now owned by Kendall Jackson. And he was an entrepreneur. He was at the time just sort of putting food on the table for us, but he has been growing, and we as a family have been growing for about 45 years. Fast forward about 20 years after that, the wall had come down. My brother and I, having grown up in California, were really interested in our Hungarian heritage, and we made our way back to Hungary and lived there in the early 90s. It was a nice place to live at the time. We were really interested in some of the changes and some of the democracy that was taking hold in the region. And while we were out there, we drank a fair bit of Hungarian wine, met a lot of winemakers, and discovered a cooperage, called Budapesti Kádár. And we started to import those barrels into Napa and Sonoma for the wine trade. Fast forward another 10 years, we moved our way back to California, found an old abandoned walnut orchard up in the high Mayacamas, and planted Obsidian Ridge. We met Michael Therrien, we started making some wine, and we made 98 cases of wine in 2002, our first vintage. So just a short, brief history on us. We've been growing for about 45 years, coopering for about 25 years, and now making wine for almost 2 decades. And we want to tell you today about the middle part of that story, which is the oak story. How, in fact, we got involved in the cooperage, what it is about Hungarian oak that really made us pay attention, and why we think it has an incredible story and a role to play in sort of international oak. So with that introduction, and I'll tell you a little at the end why we make it and why we make our wine, but I'll hand it over to Peter, who will do a little bit deeper dive into the oak part of it.
Welcome, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, I guess, over on the East Coast. So I've been involved with the cooperage since 1993. I had an early tasting with the winemaker from Antinori, who was the first winemaker in Ornellaia, named Federico Steverini. And he put on a barrel trial in southern Hungary of 6 remaining coopers who were just transitioning from the communist system, and went on to explain how his uncles and other winemakers throughout Italy had been using oak from that region for decades, and if not longer, and the opportunity that he felt that working in Hungary and rediscovering these forests. And that kind of got our story started. So I'm going to jump into the presentation and talk about what we've learned in the past almost 30 years. So we called this the nature of oak. And the reason being is that one of the things that really struck us over the years is how much barrels remind us of growing grapes. Terroir, transformation, and ultimately the creation of a beautiful set of characters when you're making wine and you're aging oak. This is what I'll talk about today. The nature of oak comprises of the different species of oak, forest terroir, forestry and sustainability, the biome of seasoning, and toasting and transformation. And I'm trying to put this together in a format that actually makes sense for you guys out there in the trade, because oh, I'm sorry, I don't know. I don't know why that recording went on. Excuse me. 2 seconds. Okay. There we go. Apologies for that. So Kádár is our cooperage, the logo on the upper right. We are the oldest continuously operating cooperage in Central Europe. But 12 years ago, we joined the Senency group, which includes Taranceau from Cognac and Bordeaux region, and Canton from Kentucky. And a lot of the presentation I'm going to show you is a combination of research that we've done over the last 2 decades on the nature of oak and how oak interacts with wine. So while I will focus on our Hungarian operation because it's the one I know best, these ideas and practices are practiced throughout the industry, whether it be in France or in the United States, and it should apply to almost any wine that you carry or represent that's aged in oak. So that's my intent here. So let's get right into the forest, where it all obviously begins. So forest terroir. Historically, oak comes from throughout Europe. French oak, of course, in the last half century has had a lot of prominence, but there have been different oak regions from the Baltics to the Carpathian to France to Georgia throughout the history of winemaking on the continent. And I start this slide basically to show you Europe without borders. And I'm going to talk about this slide over the next couple in terms of how different soil and climate characteristics change and shape the flavors and characteristics of oak. The most common part of it all is that the oak that you find throughout Europe is the same. There are 2 species that essentially were pushed to the boot of Italy and to the fingers of the Peloponnesus in Greece, the peninsula in Greece. And as the last ice age retreated, the ice stalled across the middle of the continent there. And this band of edge of ice down here is where there was enough gravel made and drainage, and the pH of the soil was ideal for oak to repopulate. So you will find oak across the middle of Europe here, obviously France to the left, but on the right is the Carpathian Basin, which is in the green. The orange area is a specific volcanic mountain range where we source our oak for our own projects and for our own wines. So let's talk about those oak species. There are essentially 2. There's sessile oak and pedunculate oak are the common names, Quercus petrea or Quercus rubor. There are about 600 species of oak. There's about 270 billion years of oak evolution. Most people believe it started from a bush in Malaysia. There are about 3.5 of them that taste good, is our thinking for wine. 2 in Europe, Quercus alba in the United States, and there's also oak up in Oregon that's used a little bit for wine, but more and more for beer. So sessile oak on the left, or Petrea oak, is oak of the rocks, the Latin term. As oak repopulated across the continent, this oak was brought along the ridges mainly by avian, so birds carrying seeds and acorns. Quercus rubor comes from the Latin word robust, because they get to be quite big. They are found usually in river courses, and they prefer damper and more fertile soil, so you'll find them in the valleys. I want to mention that most of the forest in Europe are a hybridization of the 2. Very often there are combinations of these 2 oaks. There are a few in Europe, like Trancé and the Tokaj forest, that are 100% sessile oak, or as best we can tell, 95% plus sessile oak. So the question is, what does that have to, what is the effect in the glass? Many of you have probably seen these. This is called a spider graph. This is an analysis that we do to look at the aromatics of different oak components. On the left, you'll find, in the middle, you'll find characteristics that come mainly from the oak. Let's start with lactones, which is the compound that most of us call oakiness. Oftentimes fresh oak, coconut characteristics. You have vanillin, which will give you vanilla, pretty obvious. Down to the lower right is furfurols, which are the sort of butterscotch notes. And then the top is clove, eugenol, clove, cinnamon, nutmeg, all share eugenol as a spice component. Then on the upper right, you're going to start to see components that are developed during toasting. So the guaiacols, these will give you spice, smoke, and char. I'm going to just throw this out as a general introduction to the aromatic compounds as opposed to flavor compounds, because these are predominantly aromatic, though they do give us a flavor reaction when we drink the wines. And it'll help explain this next slide. 10 years ago, we took 20 samples of oak. 10 of them were Quercus petraea and 10 of them were Quercus rubor. And we put them in a solvent and ran them through the lab, our partner laboratory in Bordeaux. We were pretty surprised by these findings. On the left is Quercus rubor, 1 through 10, and on the right is Quercus petraea, 11 through 20. You don't have to be a statistician to see that there is really pretty striking difference between the two. And as it turns out, Quercus petraea is much more aromatic than Quercus rubor. Quercus rubor tends to give more tannin. Petraea tends to give more aromatic lift. This is probably the reason why in the French industry, Trancé, which has predominantly Quercus petraea, has been so well regarded over many decades. And the same reason why the Tokaj oak in the Carpathian Basin has always been highly regarded. But it has to do with species. So let's take this a step further. Once you have that particular species, the question is terroir effects. And this is specifically comes out in grain tightness. Many of you have probably visited cellars where they talk about their tight grain barrels versus not. There's always been a respect for tight grain oak historically, and I'm going to go into why. This is a map, a geological map of the Carpathian Basin. This upper area where I'm pointing now is the youngest geological flow in Europe. It is the part of the northern Carpathian Basin where Hungary and Slovakia come together. This is an overlay of, or rather a map from the late 1800s as well, of the different oak forests throughout the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This was a forestry survey. Dark brown is pine, light brown is beech, and green is oak. And as you can see, there is a lot of oak here in the Carpathian, Northern Carpathians, Transylvania to the right, and down to the lower left is the Slavonian oak, which is the intersection of Austria, Slovenia, Croatia, and Serbia. And I'm going to talk about the terroir of this particular region here. And as we get closer, you can start to see that it's actually quite hilly. This is essentially 1,500 volcanoes, the Tokaj region, which is a subset of where we get our oak. These are volcanoes that blew up into an inland sea 4 to 6 million years ago. As you get closer to the ground, you can see that these are quite small but steep hillsides. And as you get even closer, as you get into a Jeep, you realize that every one of those hillsides looks like this underneath. 2 to 3 feet, about a yard of brown forest soil, and then underneath it, this ossified sponge-looking material. It looks like limestone, but it is actually rhyolitic tufa. It's full of little holes because of this characteristic of exploding into an inland sea. Those holes and those ossified sponge characteristics allow the rock to hold moisture enough to grow. If you look at, obviously this is winter. The seasons are cold in the winter and the growing season is quite short. And after 125 years, the trees look like this. These are about 30 to 40 centimeters across, 1.5 feet or 2. They are extremely tight grained. In fact, the tightest grained oak that we know of in the European continent. And this gives you an idea. This is our Cooper's director, András. His palm is across the half that tree there, and that's a pretty typical one. So how does this affect the taste of wine? And I will get into this presently. The sample set that you saw were from those 4 regions of the Quercus petraea on the orange and Quercus rubor down to the lower left. The climate and temperature is quite different there. It's cooler as you go to the northeast, warmer as you go down to the southwest. Same thing with rainfall. There's more rainfall to the southwest and much more cold, snowy days to the northeast. These are just to show that even though Hungary is not very big, it takes about 4 hours to drive from one end to another, maybe 5. The climatic differences are quite different, and the growing conditions of these trees are quite different. And so this is what the result is in terms of growing conditions and grain tightness. You have basically for every year 2 different sections of an annual ring. You have early wood and you have late wood. The early wood is essentially just the vegetative flush that happens in the springtime, which we've just kind of finished up in the Northern Hemisphere. It's when the leaves come out. Xylem and phloem, sugar and water are coming up and down the tree, and they create these vessels that you see in the early wood section to transport that material. That is where all of the aromatics live in oak. And the spring wood is where all of those compounds that we saw earlier, the lactones, the eugenols, et cetera, all come from. The late wood is typically darker and it is more tannic. It is, in fact, the structural part of the tree that grows to keep the tree going. So this is where we talk about the difference between the two. If you look on the right, you have this small ring. If you look on the upper right, you'll see the difference between a wide grain or a tight grain oak. You could read that as a long growing season or a short growing season. The width of the spring oak section is always the same. The amount of width of the summer oak is what the length is based on the length of the summer season. When you add that all up and you look at the lower left picture, you can see the difference is essentially that tight grained oak, where you have short growing seasons, has a much higher proportion of aromatic sections of wood to tannic sections of wood. And that is the whole shooting match. Essentially, any tight grained oak, whatever species it is and wherever it's grown in the world, will always have a bigger aromatic impact than a season with a long growing season. So this is the two concepts put together. This is another graphical representation of those 20 different samples. And on the blue is the wide grained Quercus robur, the one that comes down from the lower left-hand side of the country. As you can see, the aromatic compounds are fairly small in overall capacity, but the upper right, the tight grain Quercus petraea is much more extensive and much more pronounced, almost a 3-to-1 ratio. So this is quite a dramatic difference. It is more than noticeable in the glass. It would jump out at you basically. So let's look at that in conclusion. So taste impact. Essentially, oak from this area has relatively low tannins because it has relatively low seasoned wood, late season wood, and is 90% Petraea and sessile oak. It also has increased aromatics due to increased number of vessels and a higher proportion of spring wood. This is, again, true for this Tokaj region, but is also understandable against other different regions. I'll get into that in a second in terms of American French oak. Another interesting thing that we found is we have 20% less evaporative loss in this oak. And part of that is because we have such small vessels because it grows in that rock. But that's a topic for a much more complex topic for another day. So let's talk about American oak. American oak is all Quercus alba. Again, the grain issue stands. It's wider in the southern states and tighter in the northern states, obviously because of climate. The Minnesota oaks are quite tight grained and quite fine in aromatics, as are the higher Appalachian oaks, where it's cooler because of the elevation. American oak is higher in whiskey lactones, that coconut character. It is also less tannic than European oak. But these are the main regions where American oak is sourced today. It is at the edge of the last ice age, just as it is in Europe. And finally, the same goes for the soils. The oldest soils tend to produce the finest grained oak, partly because they're so old and depleted. The rate of growth that you get every year is fairly small, so you get tight grained oak for that reason. So our barrel, our sort of flagship barrel, is the Kádár Petraea barrel. It is the tightest grained oak that we know of in Europe, as we mentioned, and this is a tight grain selection. For those of you who know our wines, our half mile is aged 100% in Quercus Petraea. So let's get into a little bit about the forest. It was interesting to visit the forest for the first time with a vineyard eye. Everybody talks about how much work it takes to plant and wait for 3 to 5 years for a vineyard to come in. It's nothing compared to the work that they're doing out in the forest. And one of the things that was most striking is that in Central Europe, they've had a 250-year tradition of sustainable forestry. In France, it's been equally as long, slightly longer, about 300 years. In France, they did it for military reasons. The French had the building large ships of the line to fight with the Navy, with the English Navy. And they were attempting to make taller masts and longer staves for their, not staves, but planks for their ships. In Europe, it was done for, Central Europe, it was done for economic reasons. And the Forestry Law of 1769 mandated a 100-year cutting cycle. You could only cut 5 hectares at a time, which is about 12 acres. Today, we have to have a 10-year cutting plan with a 7-year confirmation, which means that when we go out to cut the forest this year, we have to demonstrate that what we cut 7 years ago was adequately replanted and re-established. We happen to have direct contracts with the foresters, as opposed to France, which is a auction system. And these are very limited forests. There's only can make about 15 to 20,000 barrels per year sustainably. Our cooperage makes about 5,000, just to give you an idea. And this is our cooperage director talking with a forester. They, in fact, do dress like this. It's pretty cool still. And they are working on site selection and quality selection for logs. And this is the kind of work that foresters do. Here he's clearing this forest region from this small new oak from weeds. But weeds, wild boar, deer, all these can go ahead and take out an oak tree at any time. So if you imagine doing that over thousands of acres, it's an undertaking. This is a tree that's made it to, 2 trees that have made it to about 15 years old. The tree on the left will never be an oak stave tree. It's just too crooked. The one on the right has some potential. There are environmental conditions to deal with. This picture shows trees that have been twisted over the years by wind in the top of this ridge. And there's constant monitoring. We were out one day and a forestry officer came in from the middle of the day, make sure we had our permits and what we were doing there. But this is, if everything goes right, after 125 years, this is what a mature stand will look like. To give you an idea, about 5% of that stand will be adequate for oak, again, because of the straightness. And here's an example of a fantastic tree. This tree will only produce about 1, maybe 1.5 barrels. The rest of the tree will be used for parquet, flooring, furniture, and also heating. A lot of the villages in our region still use wood heating for their homes. But to give you an idea, this is true of all forests. Oak is expensive and rare, and it should be well protected for that reason. In our region, they still use horses occasionally to come down. This is a tradition that's very long, as old as forestry itself, obviously. It's quite cool. It's slowly dying out because there are now a lot of machines that can do it with less erosion and less impact onto the forest. But this is a picture I took years ago. This was a horse bringing down trees down to the main road. It was very cool. So every time we buy wood, we inspect each log. We have to inspect the log not for flavor, but for structural integrity. If the grain is twisted or bent, unfortunately, we'll probably have a leaky stave. And this is our cooperage director, András, and he is going to put a serial number on every single stave and log rather. We do track all the way from forest to barrel production. partly for quality control, but also to understand the impact of different regions in the forest on flavor. And this is what they look like before transportation to our mill. Then we get into the whole issue of seasoning. So to give you an idea, seasoning originally was to get the sort of green, sappy characteristics out of barrels. This can be done in the first 6 months, by the way, fairly well. So the question is, why season for 2 to 3 years? How does mouthfeel, aromatic complexity, and other things change? And what we found, there's a whole biome of seasoning. There are literally hundreds of microflora and microfauna, bacteria and fungi that help transform the oak. This is all done in our seasoning yard in Erdőbénye, Tokaj, which you see here in the background, in the foreground. It is one of the 7 original wine towns of the Tokaj region, which with Burgundy is the oldest appellation in Europe. It is situated in Kádár, which is literally the Valley of the Coopers. There is a 1,000-year tradition of building barrels in this village. We are proudly the largest employer in town, and we have a number of coopers who work in our stave mill. And this is the mill itself. We sent up a drone shortly after expanding our wood yard, and I show this picture because you can see that we did not clear all the trees out. This was an old cattle pasture that had been regrown by the forest around it. So when we decided to go ahead and expand, we relied on a lot of climate change research that we've been doing in Bordeaux and the United States with our other partner cooperages, because as summers get hotter and drier, we are concerned with the fact that those conditions knock back the populations of fungi and bacteria that season our barrels. And we did a whole bunch of trials with shade and tarps and fences and so forth, but what we found was that having living trees nearby the stave mill is exactly what we needed. And so we built that wood yard with that intent. So let me talk about how we actually manage that stave mill and stave yard over 2 years. Again, here's our stave, got the serial number on it. We'll record when it was harvested, what section of the forest it came from, and then we split or saw them into quarters. And these quarters then are sawn down into what we call moraines, is the French term. In English, they're called stave blanks. And when they're ready, they get put out into the stave yard. We put them in a particular corner under trees, and we put a very loose netting over them. We call this the nursery. This netting ups the humidity and kind of kickstarts that evolution and the attacking of the raw wood, which is full of wood sugar, cellulose, and that's what kind of gets this whole population going. And it's all very natural. This is a fresh stave on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, those are staves that have been out for about 3 years. They almost get completely dark, almost gray and even black. And we just put them near each other, and those fungi and bacteria will jump very quickly and start to populate the new staves. And over the course of 2 to 3 years, we'll be very careful how we move those staves around. In this picture, you can see these staves here are a little bit closer than these over to the right. The reason is we want to create humidity in this section between rows number 1 and 2. The predominant wind in this region comes from the back of the picture and blows towards the front right. We want the wind to blow alongside the wood and not across it, because if the wind blew across it, it would block the downwind staves a bit. Also, we will take the bottom stack here and put it on the top, and this one will get rotated to the bottom every year. And the whole idea here is to have a consistency of seasoning so that the barrels essentially taste relatively the same. That's our intent. That's our promise to winemakers and to ourselves as well. But it's an absolutely beautiful setting. I mean, as you can see, we're right next to the forest. And we believe this is actually the most integrated natural seasoning yard in the cooperage industry today, partly because it's newly developed and using the technology and science that we've found. We are now doing trials where we've taken French oak from our sister cooperage in Cognac and brought them to this mill and vice versa to see the difference of how biome will change the character and flavoring of different oaks. And in fact, we have a sneaking suspicion that the biome of particular wood yards has the most dramatic impact in the final character of the barrel. Seasoning it seems to really give more complexity in mouthfeel and aromatics. That's what we really find, that well-seasoned oak is just basically more complex and richer in the palate without necessarily being oaky. So the final step, of course, is making the barrel. Key to that is toasting it. For many years, basically every cooperage had a house toast. Essentially, they had a habit of building a fire that was big enough to warm and bend the staves, and then that would give a certain characteristic. In the last 30 years, really since the 1980s, or 40 years at this point, there has been a lot of research on how heat and oak fire do transform oak into different characteristics. And I'll get into that in a minute here, for a minute here. The first thing we do is to get the staves warm enough to bend them. If you look in the back, that is a barrel rose, it's called, when it's an unclosed barrel. It is set over that bending fire, warming fire for about 15 minutes. Then in the foreground, it's brought to another fire where there's also a cable and a pulley. At this point, we will slowly bend those staves for about 10 minutes until they become the shape of the barrel that we know. These are not considered toasting fires. These are called warming or pre-bending and bending fires. Then we will roll the barrel over and we'll put them onto toasting fires. So here are two very different techniques of how we're toasting a barrel. One of the things I wanted to mention first off is that we only use seasoned oak to make our fire. So the ends of the staves, after 2 or 3 years, they always split a bit. We cut those off. They're 2-3 inches in length, and they became these little briquettes that we use. But if you look on the left, the basket is much larger. On the right, the basket's much smaller. Imagine the heat coming off of this in terms of distance versus the one on the right. The holes in this basket are quite a bit bigger, can radiate more heat out. The holes in this basket are quite small. And obviously the size of the fire is very different. So these are the ways that we tune the different toastings. And after the 10 to 15 minutes of pre-bending, the 10 minutes of bending, roughly that's about 20 minutes to 30 minutes, depending on the size of the barrel, we then have an additional 30 to 40 minutes of toasting at different temperatures, different intensities, different sizes of fire, and different lengths. And this is what we create, essentially different profiles in the barrel. This is not, it's very complex, but if you've toasted at home sourdough bread at light, medium, and heavy toast, then you get some idea of what the differences can be. You create much darker, more profound, even charry characteristics the longer you toast. If you keep toast very light and lean, you get much more sort of a nutty floral character out of the oak. And that's what we're going for. The oak should look like this after it's done. It's even and uniform. But really, visual measurements don't tell you much. And so we have developed a fairly interesting technology where we have a radio thermometer that's inside of the oak. It is placed in where the bunghole will be eventually. And that unit is transmitting temperature every 15 seconds to a screen behind the cooper and is actually measuring the oak itself and the temperature that it's in, much like if you would put a meat thermometer in. You can't guess how well it's done inside. And this is the display behind the cooper. If you look down to the lower right, there is a set of graphs right here. The blue line is the coolest the oak should be. The red line is the warmest it should be. And the black line is the actual temperature of the barrel. These little dips are where the cooper is instructed to add water with a spray nozzle inside the barrel just to keep the temperature from getting too high. And it also helps transform the wood a bit. But it's pretty precisely controlled. And what I want to just mention here is that if you just stay within certain bands of temperature, you create certain compounds. If you never get above a certain band, you won't create charry compounds no longer how long it's down there. And if you get above a certain temperature, you will get out of the zone of those lighter, nuttier components. So finally, we pressure test the barrel to 1 atmosphere. It's to make sure that there's no leakers. We have a filtered water that we put in there. We have a little video to show if there's any extra pieces inside. I just want to mention that we only use natural products. We use dried river reed and flour and water to seal certain parts of the barrel, primarily the head. But the only not natural product, of course, is the steel on the outside. Everything else is seasoned oak, flour, water, and aged river reeds. And when it fits all of our specifications, we put our logo on it. We package it up for distribution and for delivery. We now supply over 500 wineries in over 20 countries a year. The Central European oak has really found its place again in the world of wine, and we can get into that in a bit. This happens to be a 300-liter barrel. This is one of the ones we use predominantly for the Poseidon Chardonnay. We like that ratio, but we make a number of different sizes. The traditional Burgundy Bordeaux, 300, 400, and 500 liter. We have been very happy to see the evolution of large format barrels. Almost half of our barrels now are 300 liter and above. You may have known this barrel as a hogshead. The Australians have used these very much for a long time. It really shows an evolution in winemakers thinking about barrel types, barrel sources, and barrel ratios for their different wines. Taking just the Bordeaux and Burgundy model doesn't work in Piedmont, or it doesn't necessarily work in Willamette Valley, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to talk a little about the heritage of this particular region. I mentioned it's a 1,000-year history of winemaking, of cooperage. This is an example of why. This is a map of all the wine regions in Central Europe, Austro-Hungary at the time in the late 1800s. It had the same acreage as France did at the time. As you can see, literally hundreds of small regions. Really interesting concentration, of course. Burgenland and Slovenia are here. Western Hungary are there. Transylvania has a lot of beautiful wine regions, especially in uplifted limestone. And then Hungary has a lot of volcanics north of Lake Balaton and the Tokaj region and Eget, as some of you may know. What I want to show with this slide is that our evolution as a cooperage has been closely tied with the reawakening and rebirth of Central European winemaking. There's a ton of really cool varietals, a lot of history, and over the past 3 decades, just an amazing evolution of the quality of those wines. Frankly, I feel like, we have 100 or so customers throughout this region for the cooperage. We taste those wines regularly. And in my slightly biased opinion, but having tasted these quite over many years, I think some of the most exciting wines in the wine industry will be coming from this part of the world for the next couple decades. Just a lot of interesting things, and our work is a big part of that with them. We collaborate with our winemakers. I want to give you guys an example of Tokaj, which of course makes the sweet wines that we all know of, but in the last decades has been working on the dry formings. And the gentleman on the right here is István Szepsi Jr. His family has been making wines for, I believe, 22 generations. His ancestor, István Szepsi as well, wrote the formula for Tokaj in the late 1500s, 1568, I believe. So it's very, very cool to have that tradition to work with. It's a little bit like tasting wine with Dom Perignon's, or champagne with Dom Perignon's descendants. Here we're tasting a 500-liter barrel with what we call light medium toast. This was a toast that we developed specifically for Formint, where they did not want to have those darker, more intense toasty flavors. Formint is an aromatically shy varietal, but has a lot of structure and acidity, and we wanted to respect that. So this is an example of the trials that we do. We actually even grafted this experience onto our wines in California. A lot of our Poseidon Chardonnay that is now done in this light medium toast because it doesn't give too much creaminess in the wine and keeps it a little bit more focused. We also have a small cellar at the stave mill. We make our own wines. So if you ever do find yourself coming out to Tokai, look us up. These are the very traditional Gunzi barrels. They're 136 liters. 4 of our coopers at the stave mill actually have official or certified winemaking training. I would say probably more than half of the coopers have vineyards in their own backyard. So we do make some of our local wine there. It's quite delicious. And it is in the traditional sweet system or style. Another kind of history note, this is a picture of our cooperage director, András, who was in the previous slide. His grandfather was a forester in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He managed close to 250,000 acres of forest and had 300 foresters working for him. So there's a lot of history, a lot of tradition through here. And I'll finish with this. I did the 23andMe just for the hell of it a few years ago. Obviously, pretty widespread of where in Europe. And I use it as inspiration for doing a mock-up of a DNA for oak. We are using DNA for oak these days on some of our advanced trials. The cost of that analysis has come down. But what I want to leave with this slide is to say that there's no such thing as an average European oak. If there was, it would be that red dot. There's no such thing as an average European, as the previous slide showed. What we're finding is that the combination of species, terroir, and history together are showing us a much more complex picture of the oak in Europe and all of the different effects of oak that oak can have on wine. And it's super interesting. It gets well beyond this whole idea of is it French oak, is it Hungarian oak, and all that sort of thing. No, I think what we should really look at is what forest is it from, what species is it, what are the conditions it grows in, and then adjust that, as winemakers do, to the types of wines that they're making. They're no good or bad oaks. They're just different tools that they can use. And this has been our work. And I think that the refinement of coopering over the past 2.5 decades that we've been involved with has been quite surprising. And I think there's a lot more to go. So with that, I will leave with our final slide. There's a lot of pride in this work. Kerepesi Lotzi is in the foreground there. He's our master cooper. He came to our cooperage in he was 82. He was 14 years old. He and I are the same age. And he came in as apprentice cooper and has worked with us ever since. He builds our casks that you see there pretty much by hand. There's not a lot of machinery that can make a cask like that. It's a great tradition. We are making more and more casks. We're selling a lot of them to, of course, Northern Italy, but all around the world, including California. This year, we're bringing in 2 of these casks for our own production for Pinot and Chardonnay. And last year, this is our new planting for Obsidian Ridge. The very first vintage we put into this 1,200 liter tank. We just tasted it last week with the cellar team, and we think it has the potential to be the best Cabernet we've ever made, which is not bad for a brand new vineyard. It's the first time we've used a wood cask in our own production. So there's always something new to learn, and there's always something new to improve on. So with that, I hope that was informative, and I'll take questions. And
thanks, Peter. There's a couple questions on the chat. I'll just fill in a couple little bits of information that, when Peter and I showed up in Budapest in the early 90s as 20-year-olds, we knew none of this information. So this information and this knowledge we gathered over many decades, but we were struck by something, which was the quality of the wines in the region at the time. And we were struck by the quality of the coopering that had already existed. And so we began to think about why that was. And what we learned was that the French used to source their oak from all over Europe. And a French barrel was French because it was made by a French cooper, not because it exclusively came from a French forest. And so it really started to open our mind and open our thinking about what quality is and where you find it. We were driven by the same thinking when we planted Obsidian Ridge. A lot of people said you couldn't really grow great Cabernet outside of the Napa boundaries, but we thought a little differently about it. And I think the knowledge and the history that Peter talked about that has been established is incredible. It's hundreds of years of technical and craftsmanship that's been sort of developed. People often ask us, well, why do you use a Hungarian cooperage? Is it because you are Hungarian, you have a Hungarian origin? And we tend to think about it, it's the ingredient we know best. So similarly, like a chef, if you grow your own vegetables or maybe raise your own meat, you have real knowledge, maybe more than control over your ingredients. And that's the thing that really has driven us. There are almost no wineries outside of the really big ones like Gallo that own their vineyards, own a cooperage, and own and make their own wine. So we, I would say, got here through as much luck as work, but we sort of sit and are on the shoulders of a lot of history. But it bears to know that when we taste a wine, we should be very open to where it comes from, why it's made the certain way it is, and as long as it's good, it's good. Peter, there's a question about tannins on the chat. If you could see. So
this is a really fascinating topic. The French, by far, have the most sophisticated enological laboratory services in the world. They're hands down. Nobody has been able to develop ability to measure wood tannin and wine tannin in the same glass. It's beyond my pay grade to know exactly why. But what I will say is that tannin is not additive in terms of perception. Wood tannin tends to hydrolyze grape tannin. It means it draws a water molecule to it and it makes it less reactive with our saliva. So in fact, there's been a misconception historically where people thought, oh, you shouldn't put tannic wine into, well, there's not scientifically misconception that tannic wood would make tannic wine more tannic. It does, the tannin numbers do go up. We can measure the total tannin numbers, but it doesn't in terms of the olfactory impact. It's a really big part with fruit that's Cabernet, for example, that's already varietally tannic, and or mountain fruit. We find that with Obsidian Ridge. We use half new oak on the estate, partly for that reason. So there's a lot of research that's being figured out on that. But yes, in fact, that's how oak does soften tannins. The other thing is that there's also a matrix effect in how we perceive wine. A lot of times oak is also quite refreshing. One of the things that's been surprising in our research is that oak has a very high antioxidant potential. We can actually put an electrode on one end of the stave, an electrode on the other, and how quickly the electricity moves will measure the antioxidant capacity of that oak. And so antioxidant keeps fruit fresher. So having wine in barrel, especially if you're not doing a lot of rack and return, will actually reduce the oxygen amounts of the wine and keep the freshness of the fruit, which again, the way our mouths are, architecture and of taste, the more fresh fruit will correspondingly make the tannin less obvious. So there are both chemical and also matrix effects in terms of how barrels make tannic wine more palatable. I hope that answers it.
One of the other stylistic things that we observe freshness and lift in fruit. So both our Poseidon Vineyard Chardonnay and our Obsidian Ridge Cabernet have a freshness to them that doesn't give you, particularly with the Cabernet, that sort of weighed down sort of feeling. Historically, it's interesting to note that the reason French oak really was driven into the California industry was when California still first started making Cabernet and really wanted to make world-class Cabernet in the 60s and 70s. They looked abroad and decided that Bordeaux was the place you made the best Cabernet or the highest value Cabernets. And the French in Bordeaux used French oak. It turns out the French in Bordeaux used French oak not only because it was a local source of oak, but also because French oak gives vanillins and a sweetness to a wine and a grape in Bordeaux that sometimes doesn't get the full ripeness or struggles sometimes to get the ripeness. If you take a very ripe California fruit, we have no problem here in California getting to ripeness. And if you take a ripe Cabernet and you add sort of vanillins to it, you tend to get, or you can get, an over-the-top, big, maybe sweet Cabernet. And that's something that we would avoid, or we do avoid, because Hungarian oak or Central European oak tends to have less of the vanillin components, as Peter mentioned, more of the eugenols, more of the spicy notes. So you have to be very careful about what oak you apply to what wine and how, because it's not necessarily, historic reasons are partially valid, but partially they're not valid. And we really try to find a good style of wine, and we match oak to find and get that style. Don't know if there's any more questions. We're coming up on our hour. I'll say just a couple last things about the oak tree behind us. And we know this is a tough time for everybody, for retailers and distributors and others. That oak tree has been around for a very, very long time. You obviously know what we make. We make wine in barrels. Peter talked about, really how we make those items and how we make barrels. But the question is also why. We are here for a very long time. My brother and I took on this project with Michael to make wines for the next 30 and 40 years. We sometimes go to the bottom of Obsidian Ridge and sit next to the tree behind me and think about how long that tree's been there. It's survived drought, and it survived humans. It survived fires. It survived the 1918 pandemic. It was even around in the 1539 Black Plague. So it's a little bit how we think about what we do. You need to have a lot of patience and a lot of time if you want to really get good at making barrels or making wine, and that's hopefully what we bring to the things we do. We think we're very passionate about it. We take it very seriously, but we'd love to have you come out either to Hungary or come out to Obsidian Ridge, see the tree, to see the view from the top overlooking the volcano. But thank you for your partnership mostly. Thank you for selling our wines. And if there's, feel free to pass this along to your sales folks. We're happy to provide this to you. We really think the more knowledge and the more people understand how wine and how barrels are made, the better it is for them, the better it is for the industry. None of this is proprietary. We want to share it as much as we can. So with that, I'll pass it off to Elise. Elise, I don't know if you had any final thoughts, but thank you, everyone, for being here today.
Thank you. Well, in final closing, thank you again all for your time. I realize that this is kind of the middle of the day for you. We'll probably be doing these again at some point in the fall. Next week at around the same time, we have a webinar on the elevation of wine. And also, if you're interested but can't make that time, we have one a little bit later in the day for you, for those of you who are on the East Coast. We have one that's at 6 o'clock, and we'd be happy to share that link with you. Just reach out to me through the original communication I sent to you, and I'm happy to do that. Otherwise, we do plan to put this on our website, and we invite you to share this with your teams. We can also do the for your teams as well down the road if you want to dedicate something that's specific just for them. Otherwise, thank you for your time. Happy Monday, and we wish you all safety and well-being. Have a great one. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.